There is something raw and small about every neighborhood squabble that somehow grows into a story people tell for weeks. Today's story begins on a bright Saturday morning when the parking lot at the strip of shops near the corner looked like a postcard. Sunlight glinting off cars, the deli's awning flapping in a soft breeze, people carrying coffee cups and dogs on leashes. The handicapped space closest to the doors sat empty, the blue paint and the sign bright against asphalt. It had been empty long enough that folks walking past had given it a casual glance and kept moving until she arrived. She pulled up in an oversized SUV with chrome accents and a bumper sticker that reads something smug about entitlement. She was already on her phone, animated, laughing at someone invisible through the tinted glass. She coasted into the handicapped spot without lowering the window, without hesitation. No placard hung from the rear view, no permit on the dash. It was a move so ordinary and yet so brazen it made people pause. A woman pushing a stroller stopped mid-step. An older man with a cane hardened his features. The clerk at the bakery watched from the door as if waiting for a necessary interruption. I, standing with a cold drink in my hand, felt the first flicker of that familiar, furious heat because I knew what it felt like to hunt for parking once, twice, and then to circle the block with a bad knee and a cooler of sympathy tucked into the trunk. It seemed small until it hit close. She stepped out, high heels clacking, and zipped her handbag with a self-important snap. Her phone was still in her hand. A teenager by the soda machine laughed and nudged his friend. Someone said something under their breath. The sound rippled, small, and then louder. From across the lot, a police cruiser rolled up. It eased toward the curb with the kind of calm that lets everyone know someone official has arrived, and people turned toward it like sunflowers following light. The officer who stepped out was in his mid-40s, salt and pepper hair visible beneath. His cap, quiet eyes that surveyed the scene without quick judgment. He walked toward the SUV with that measured pace cops build like armor, steady, purposeful. When he asked the woman for her placard, his voice was polite, neither soft nor sharp. It was the voice people use when they want to give someone a chance. "I don't need a placard," she said, like a fact. "I'm just running in for a minute." "Do you have a permit?" the officer asked. "No," she said. "I don't have to have one. I'll be right back." There are rules for almost everything, and there are exceptions. People who have the right to a handicap spot usually know the rules by heart. Permit displayed, used only by authorized persons, parked only for the vehicle with the permit. But people who feel above rules often think a polite refusal counts as an explanation. The officer asked again, gently, to see proof. A small crowd collected without realizing they would. A woman with a walker shuffled closer. Eyes narrowed. A young dad holding his daughter's hand stood at the curb. The atmosphere was tight with curiosity. She set her jaw and repeated the promise. A minute and turned away, assuming that would be the end of the story. That's when the officer did something nobody expected. Instead of issuing a ticket, instead of towing the car or lecturing the woman about civic decency, he opened his palm and asked a question that sounded like an ordinary bureaucratic inquiry but carried more weight. "Would you mind stepping out for a moment?" She blinked, surprised, expecting confrontation. Instead, she found herself being led, by that steady, non-threatening presence, into the storefront where a tiny community clinic operates. The clinic is the kind of modest place with folding chairs and a counter lined with brochures. Inside was an older man with a folded letter in his lap and a metal cane leaning beside him. Beside him sat a teenage girl in a wheelchair, braided hair falling to her shoulders, eyes like glass filled with rain. She watched as the woman who had taken the spot came in, confusion giving way to an awkward kind of curiosity. "You can wait here," the officer said to the woman who had taken the space. Someone's been waiting to talk. Now everyone's tempo shifted. You could hear the entire parking lot inhale. The woman protested murmurs about privacy, about wasting time, about harassment, before the reality settled around her. She had an audience, and the officer had invited her into a story she might not have expected to belong to. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed, looking as if the day had suddenly become an imposition. The teenager in the wheelchair, a girl named Maya, the officer later told me was quiet but straight-backed. She had a list of appointments. She had a transporter to catch. Her father had dropped her off because whatever had happened to her legs when she was 8 had not softened his voice when he asked for help. He'd placed the wheelchair in the space she could get to from the entrance and waited for care, for someone to come out and let them through. He had a permit, of course. It hung on his rear view like a badge of survival. He'd walked from the car with the cane, but every step took focus and gave less grace. When the officer explained who the girl was, The air felt spun from thin glass. The woman who had taken the spot made a face that mixed annoyance and a flash of something else, maybe recognition. She kept stepping back as the officer told the story in that way officers sometimes do. Concise, factual, but with an undercurrent of humanity. The young girl needed to be in that space for her father to get her inside without pain. The sign was not a suggestion. It was a tool. Something about seeing the physical manifestation of the problem, the wheelchair, the folded letter, the father's careful balance pushed against the woman's defenses. There was an awkward pause, then a kind of mechanical apology that had no warmth in it. I didn't think, she said. It was the most common apology in the world, practically useful, emotionally vacant. The officer could have let it end there. He could have written a ticket and walked back to the cruiser and let the world generate its usual outrage and forget. But he surprised everyone again. He asked the woman to take the teenager's wheelchair and wheel the girl outside, to the place she had taken. Just sit in it, he said. Just for a moment. There was a sound like a held breath breaking across the room. She scoffed at first. What? No, that's ridiculous. I'm not. Just sit, the officer repeated. For 5 minutes. There's a strange power in direct asks when paired with calm logic. It's easier sometimes to comply with a simple, actionable request than to maintain defiance. The crowd watched as she frowned, fiddled with her phone, then, with something like resignation, sat in the plastic seat. At first, her posture stood like a statue. She crossed her arms and stared ahead, as if that made the world understand her discomfort. But the practical truth of being in a wheelchair is that gravity and space rearrange themselves. You sense the seat beneath you, the metal frame, the tiny differences in how someone hands you a sandwich, or how a curb becomes a cliff and a threshold becomes a mountain. The teenage girl smiled with that awkward generosity people who've had to forgive often have. Don't wreck it, she said. And the woman barked a tiny laugh that might have been a real one, almost embarrassed at its own sound. The officer asked the woman to move the chair across a short patch of sidewalk. She pushed. At first she pushed like she was moving a trolley, the wheels sticking, her hands not used to this new leverage. She misjudged the lip of a curb, and the wheelchair caught, jolting both her and the girl. The girl winced not from pain, but from the familiarity of being jostled by people who didn't know how to help. The woman's face changed. Something like confusion or maybe shame crossed it slowly. She had thought this would be an exercise in humiliation she could weather. Instead, she felt the awkwardness of dependence, the smallness of relying on strangers. The way the world has to bend just a little extra for some people to pass through. For a moment she looked as if she had been given the wrong script for her life and had to improvise. The officer didn't gloat. He didn't instruct her in a theatrical way. He said, "You have to make sure to leave these for people who need them. It's not inconvenience. It's access." And then he did something else, something that widened the arc of the story into something the whole strip of stores would talk about. He offered a choice. He could write a ticket, fine her, and move on. That's the default. But he could also do something different. He could make this an opportunity for understanding rather than punishment. He asked if she would consider volunteering an hour at the clinic to learn about accessibility, to help a family once, to sit and listen to people who relied on the systems such signs represented. The officer's tone suggested this was more than a token gesture. The offer felt like a challenge wrapped in possibility. There was an unspoken assumption. This was not charity, it was accountability with human consequence. She bristled, defensive. "Why should I have to do that?" she said. "Because you took something that wasn't yours," he replied, simple as a fact. "Because sometimes the best way to understand is to see." She flipped her hair as if she could shake the request free, then watched as the father in the room helped his daughter with a small plastic toy. The man's hands were gentle and practiced. He smiled at the girl with a tired tenderness. It was impossible to look away. No one expected what came next. She hesitated, then nodded once, sharp, quick, like a door clicking shut. The officer smiled with the ease of someone used to reading complicated human transactions. He wrote something down on a small pad. He did not read it aloud. He didn't have to. The crowd outside murmured. People recorded on phones. This part of the story was cheap in public terms. The spectacle everyone knew how to film. But what the officer wrote was not a mere citation. He had arranged for the woman to do two things: to pay the administrative fine for the parking violation, and to spend 4 hours at the clinic the afternoon, helping with tasks, carrying groceries, holding a door, making appointments. So she could see how small privileges stack into large advantages. She grumbled her way through the first hour. Her movements were begrudging and manual, the servile tasks lit by a stubborn pride. But the clinic is quick at what it does best: It places human beings in proximity until defenses unwind. She learned how to fold a paper wheelchair cushion. She learned how to hold an umbrella over a seated person who couldn't grip. She learned how to gently push a wheelchair down a ramp without acting like she was sovereign over movement. By the third hour, something about her attitude shifted. It didn't evaporate into instant sainthood. No one changes that fast. But she did begin to listen. She listened to a mother who had been turned away by an indifferent landlord, to a veteran who had lost a foot and found new patients in the rhythm of physical therapy, to a young man who told her about the tiny, endless frustrations of a society not built for him. She listened to a girl who used a wheelchair and who spoke about waiting for an accessible van and the shame of being left behind. At some point, a woman who'd recorded the initial confrontation approached her and said, "You didn't have to come in." "Thank you." The woman who had taken the spot looked at her like she had been asked a heavy favor. "I didn't think," she said again, softer. For once it sounded like a sentence in 3 parts, not a reflex. The officer, meanwhile, had not yet finished his lesson. He gathered the small group, the volunteers, the clinic staff, the woman from the SUV, the teenager in the wheelchair, and asked if anyone would help push a couple of braille signs he'd had made with the neighborhood association. People laughed, surprised, then nodded. They taped signs to doors, painted curb cuts, and marked loading zones. The cop who'd arrived for what should have been a routine enforcement had turned the parking lot into a hive of practical, immediate repair. By the time the afternoon washed into evening, the woman had moved beyond apology. She helped secure a donated mobility ramp to a van. She carried groceries for a neighbor back to a third-floor walk-up because the building's elevator was broken. People who had assumed she'd simply be a character in a viral clip watched her work. A few filmed, awkwardly, their feeds already brimming with judgments they might later soften. The most surprising part came when the teenager in the wheelchair, Maya, turned to her and said, "You know, if you ever need to get around, I can show you how to use one without breaking it." The woman blinked. A smile that didn't quite reach the eyes formed, then melted. "I might take you up on that," she said. The cop wrote a report that evening, but it wasn't just a list of infractions. It noted the violation, the fine, and the restorative action. He described how people in that parking lot had chosen a different story where accountability met empathy, where a hard conversation became an ordinary chance to pick up a broom and sweep. He filed the paperwork and handed the fine to the woman. She paid it without dramatics, quick and clean. But later, when she left, she paused by the door and turned to the crowd. "I'm sorry," she said in a voice more real than any she'd used before. "I was thoughtless." People clapped, a smattering at first, then louder, not because clapping finishes things, but because communities like applause when someone stands up and tries to be better. It feels like encouragement for the long haul. The story that went viral was not the initial outrage, but the footage of her kneeling with a volunteer to secure a ramp, a tiny act of repair against bigger negligence. The comments piled up. Some generous, some mocking, some cynical, accusing her of doing it for likes. But the people there that day, the father with the cane, the bakery clerk, the officer with the even voice, knew the truth. Small, honest labor can rewrite a moment quicker than any lecture. There's a lesson in the way the cop acted. He could have let fury fuel a ticket and time the next social media sensation. He could have amplified division by playing the villain. Instead, he chose a path that made sense in the messy space between law and conscience. Enforce, yes, but not only that. Invite someone to understand what their misuse actually costs other people. Give them labor instead of merely penalty. Give them proximity instead of only punishment. Months later, the clinic installed a permanent sign and a new bench where families could wait. The woman who took the spot put in more hours than the officer had required. She still had blemishes of arrogance. All habits take time. But she also started showing up at community cleanups. Maya and the woman exchanged messages sometimes. Maya sent a photo of a new adaptive skateboard she'd been learning to ride. Once, the woman posted a short video. A pair of hands fastening a wheelchair ramp. People cheered. Skeptics rolled eyes. But a handful of neighbors reached out for real help the next week, and the woman met them. The cop who started the morning with a simple request told me later, when I asked what made him step beyond the ticket, that enforcement without empathy feels empty. You make people pay, and they learn to avoid being caught, he said. You give people a reason to change, and sometimes they do. The real shock wasn't the dramatic arrests or the justice served with sirens. The shock was quieter. A woman who could have driven away with impunity stayed. A police officer invited her into the life she'd inconvenienced. People watched an ordinary man in a uniform choose an uncommon route, restorative, patient, direct, and in the end, a handicapped space returned to its purpose. There are infinite ways a day like that could have ended. with a confrontation that cracked into more anger, with a ticket checked off and forgotten, with a viral clip that only inflamed. Instead, a small group of neighbors made a different choice. They turned a moment of entitlement into a lesson, not a spectacle. They made an authority figure the conduit for a softer kind of justice. And for a strip mall on a quiet Saturday, that turned out to be enough to change a few routines and maybe one life. When I walk past that parking lot now, I look for the blue space. It's there, paint fresh, painted by the volunteers with clean edges. Sometimes, late mornings when the light sits just right, I see the woman who once parked in it without thinking, arriving. In a smaller car, carrying a reusable bag, and then, for a long while, never taking in a handicapped spot again. She parks at the far end because someone taught her the cost of convenience and because she learned there's dignity in choosing to carry another person's burden for a while.